What is the scariest story you know to be completely true? Caution: this story contains unsettling elements and viewer discretion is advised. Guy I used to work with was murdered and dismembered by his crime partner, who was caught just nonchalantly driving his vehicle around town. A couple years before, I had had a conversation with him, the murder victim, about concealed carry licenses and how that would work inside a workplace, and he told me the story about his ex-wife was plotting to kill him and how he'd worked out carrying a gun on campus with security, only to be murdered and dismembered by someone else a couple years later. My cousin picked up a hitchhiker about 20 years ago. Nice enough guy. Cousin was hungry, so stopped at McDonald's, grabbed the hitchhiker some breakfast, too. Dropped him off where the guy had said he was headed. No big deal. Next morning, my cousin's watching the morning news and sees that hitchhiker's face. Dude was a serial killer and had killed someone that picked him up. Cousin calls the cops and they have him come in. Turns out the hitcher had killed the very next person after my cousin that had given him a ride. He'd killed a few people that had given him rides. That was his MO. They asked the hitcher why he didn't kill my cousin. He said, I'd planned to, but he was a really nice young man, he bought me breakfast. I couldn't kill someone that bought me breakfast. User replies. Oh wow. I had something similar happening to me. When I was younger, I was in Colombia, the country, and at some point I was drunk and took a taxi back to my hotel. I was hungry, so I asked the driver to drive by McDonald's first. And I got a bunch of food and invited the taxi driver as well. We had a good conversation and later on he dropped me off. Just before he dropped me off, he told me that I should never just get a random taxi in Bogota, and that he actually intended to rob me with his buddies that were waiting a little further down the road of said McDonald's, but because I bought him food he didn't go through with it. Spooky. Someone at my school vanished for a week with no leads other than a video of him on a security camera at a McDonald's 2 towns over. A week later his body turned up in the lake in a bay. They never figured out what happened to him. User replies. People disappear all the time, but it really is weird when it's someone you know. I grew up in Toronto but moved away after grade 7. The credit card company used to put pics of missing kids on their statements and, decades later, I recognized the girl on the envelope. We had gone to public school together. She had very dark hair, almost black, and a distinctive gap between her front teeth. Turns out a couple years after I moved out west she disappeared. There were been some sightings in the 2 or 3 years that followed, but nothing solid. And in next 30 or so years, nothing. I was hiking down from doing 2 weeks of trail work in Colorado a few summers ago. A guy hiking up stopped to chat with us about our work and asked if we had seen anyone make the summit while we were up there. We told him that the first summit of the season had been done a few days prior and wished him luck. A friend of mine hiked in that area the next day and there was a helicopter circling around. The guy had taken the wrong gully back down and died. It's still crazy to me to think about. Worked with kids in foster care. A 17-year-old girl says she's got a secret to tell her casa. Now we got a rape SWAT team for this, 'cause 17-year-old girls in foster system, 9 out of 10 it is rape. Well, she sits down and tells how her family was cartel and her cousins were enforcers. One day when she was like 8, her cousins pick her up and take her out to the desert where they have a 5-year-old boy. They make her choke him to death. I guess he was the kid of a family that owed them money. Usually for getting smuggled over. Needless to say, we didn't have a game plan for that shit. The police basically said, and no body no crime, since we had no actual details to identify on and the cousins she could name were dead, not in the country, or already in prison. Poor kid confessed she was forced to murder a child with her bare hands, and the result was nothing. No justice for her, for the kid, for the family. Just I guess shit happens. Year later she was 18 and out of the system to face a world she knows to be wildly different than how we all claim it to be in work. My dad got into a car crash, head-on with a convertible with a young couple in it, and the top part of the convertible window decapitated them instantly. He ended up falling into something red, berries, blood. And when the cops and medics showed up, they were freaking out and telling him to lay down. He was actually fine. Witnessing that screwed him up though. User replies. This reminds me of a story. One day I'm out in my front yard cleaning my boat. My neighbor, Bob, comes over to chat and I take a break to drink a beer with him. About that time, another neighbor Mark strolled on by and we invited him to have a beer too. So we're sitting there on my boat drinking beer and we're catching up asking how everyone's kids are doing, etc. Mark says, "Oh well, my boy's doing all right. The therapy is going well." Bob and I look at each other, turns out neither of us knew he was in therapy. So I say, "Glad to hear he's doing better. What's he in therapy for?" Mark replies, "Oh right, I never told you. We ended up being right behind an accident a few weeks ago, and we were the first on scene. Well, my boy and I get out and try to help, but unfortunately the first thing my son found was the head of a little girl. She got decapitated on impact. We replied with shock and consolation. But then Mark said, "Yeah, we hope he'll start talking again soon. I really miss hearing his voice." I moved away a few months later. Never did find out if Mark's son started talking again. Car accidents are terrifying. When I was a kid, there was a peeping Tom in the neighborhood. But the weird part is we all knew who he was, a little older guy named Ralph who lived a couple streets over and smoked like a chimney. We knew, because he was caught once early on, by a neighbor while on their roof, watching them through the skylight. The neighbor had left a ladder against the house when doing work earlier that day, but after that he was like a ghost, impossible to catch. People would find footprints and cigarette butts outside windows, smell cigarette smoke, and occasionally see the red cherry on the cigarette glow in the woods. Occasionally angry dads and teenagers who spotted him out in the darkness would give chase, but he moved like a deer through the woods and no one could put hands on him. The cops were involved a few times and they dragged him in, but it was never for long, partially I think, because he had a disabled wife for whom he was the sole carer. He was sorta a neighborhood boogeyman, though thankfully seemed mostly harmless if terribly creepy. Many years later, there were a rash of break-ins around the neighborhood. People even joked at the time that it must not be Ralph, because we all figured he had copies of everyone's hide keys already, if he wanted to go inside. Side note, we later learned that he definitely did have keys to some houses. Anyway, everyone's guard was up. One night, one of the neighbors heard a commotion outside, and ran outside to find a stranger laid out in his driveway, beat to shit. They called 911, and when the police arrived, they were able to identify the guy as someone who had previous arrests for breaking and entering, and found items from the previous break-ins in his vehicle nearby and later at his apartment. As for how he ended up taking a bloody nap in the driveway, he said he was jumped from behind in the dark and never got a good look at the guy. All he remembered for certain was that the guy stunk of cigarette smoke. Edit, dang, a bunch of people are curious about the keys. Basically we learned that one of the times he was picked up, they'd found a ton of keys on a pegboard. He claimed he just collected keys he'd found, and they had no labeling so there was no way to prove otherwise. So maybe he was just an avid key collector, but, come on. I knew a man who tranquilizer his 6 kids and then shot them. When his wife returned home, the house was burning and while she was agonizing over the kids, he stared her in the face and slit his own throat. Stupid fucker didn't do it right and survived. In prison for the rest of his hopefully tortured life. His name was Jay Handel. You already made it halfway through the video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Let's continue. Real scary guy I knew, through a mutual friend, once claimed he'd wait purposely to murder a rival of his, in front of their children, so that his legacy of treachery would be remembered. He then went on to do exactly that, shot a man to death at the breakfast table in front of wife and kids. A friend's father just dropped dead while brushing his teeth with his youngest daughter, 6-year-old. They never found out what happened, so they figured he had a brain hemorrhage. User replies. Happened to my ex's father. He was late 50s and perfectly healthy. He traveled to London for a conference for work. He called after landing and checking into his hotel. Then, no one heard from him for 36 hours. They were able to get in touch with the police, who did a welfare check. They found he had died of a brain hemorrhage shortly after getting to his hotel room. My uncle and his girlfriend were hitchhiking down the mountains of Colorado and were picked up by a man. A little ways down the road, he stops the car and asks my uncle if he can check the tire. He thinks he ran something over. My uncle gets out and the man drives away with his girlfriend and pulled a weapon on her. She immediately opens the door and jumps out while he's driving. My uncle and his girlfriend reconvene and were okay, just were trying to process what happened. At a later time on the news they saw a story about a serial killer, and it ended up being the man who picked them up. It was Ted Bundy. One of my elementary school friends ended up working as a gunman for a cartel. He was killed this year in a gunfight with the army. Not really a scary story, but it messes me up every time I give it a thought, just reflecting in how different our paths in life became. I'm actually happy in doing good in life, both emotionally and economically. He, on the other hand, had drug addiction issues too young and unfortunately ended up joining with the wrong people in the wrong place. My family literally had a party to die for. We hosted a super late Christmas party in March. We invited a few neighbors over, including an older couple. Beyond a few weird comments from the old husband like, "I'm so glad I could have one last good meal," we all had a good time. Everyone kept telling us how great the party and food was. Eventually the old couple go home a bit earlier than the rest of the guests, and we don't think anything of it. About an hour later, as another guest was about to leave, they come rushing back into the house yelling about police and medics on our street. Turns out the husband of the old couple simply dropped dead about 30 minutes after they got home. I guess, to be fair, a big talking point at the party was how he was already basically on his last leg, thanks to health conditions, and it was only a matter of time, but we didn't think it'd be that soon. This one is personal. My family and I are staying in a rental house for a few months because my dad was bad with money. This particular house was owned by a fairly wealthy friend of his, who was going through a divorce because his wife had developed a long and nasty drug problem. So, we're staying there pretty cheap. One night near Christmas, I groggily wake up and see a woman wearing white going through drawers on the other side of the room. I must have made a sound, because she turned and rushed over to me and gently said, "Go back to sleep, little boy." Weirdly, I did. She looked like Liza Minnelli, if that's at all relevant. Next morning I wake up to my parents acting weird, and I hear one of them make a comment like, "I can't tell what's gone and what's not." For some reason, I didn't connect the dots until I was older and never told them what I saw. I thought it was a dream. So, yeah, the former crackhead owner of our rental house broke in, probably had a key, and I saw her but didn't do or say shit. I was probably 9 or so. I'll tell a very personally scary one. Good friend of mine from high school was driving his perfectly normal family in their perfectly normal minivan on the highway. They were on vacation, headed to Disney World. A pickup coming the other way crossed the center line and hit them head-on. He and his 2 sons were killed instantly. His wife and daughter, the youngest child, were critically injured but survived. He was literally one of the 2 or 3 genuinely kindest people I ever met. Got up that morning all set for a fun family adventure. Cruising along the highway, and then lights out. In an instant. And his wife/daughter left behind to go it alone. Bad things happen, to good people. To anyone. And you don't see them coming. As a parent, that's scary. A really popular athlete that I went to school with got married to his high school sweetheart and had 3 kids. He also was having an affair with a woman from Sweden. She apparently convinced him to kill his entire family. He was on some kind of antidepressants at the time and not acting himself. After he killed his family, he flew to Sweden and killed the woman he was having the affair with. He then shot himself. It was the craziest thing I had ever heard, but so scary at the same time. I knew this guy. I grew up with him and he had good parents and a nice childhood. Scary to think what made him turn into a monster. My high school girlfriend called late one night after I was home and in bed. She said that something had happened and asked if I could come over. She was clearly shaken and not full of details. So I told my parents and drove over towards her house. At the top of her subdivision, I was met by a cop with lights on. He asked where I was going and I told him about the call from my girlfriend. He lets me go by and I come over the hill to the cul-de-sac, where she lives, and I see multiple cop cars around the circle. They watch me pull up and get out of my car. My girlfriend comes running out of her house and meets me in the street. She explains that someone had broken into her neighbor's house and started beating her with something heavy. The neighbor managed to get out of the house and headed to my girlfriend's house, where she started banging furiously on the front door. My girlfriend's dad was out of town, so her mom answered the door and the neighbor just fell into the foyer bleeding profusely from the head. Her mom looks up to see the attacker headed up the walkway towards the front door. She pulls the neighbor into the house and closes the door, hitting the attacker with it before it fully closed. He then took the heavy tool he had used to beat the neighbor and smashed the little window at the top of the door. Her mom started screaming and the attacker just turned around and walked up the street into the darkness. I spent the night there that night, along with 2 or 3 cops outside in their cars, and in the morning we could see blood still pooled on the floor in the foyer and splattered blood above the front door from where the attacker had swung the bloody tool to smash the window. No one was ever caught or even identified. It was just completely random. The neighbor survived and to my knowledge had no permanent physical injuries beyond scarring from having her scalp stapled shut. She moved away shortly after the incident. My ex-brother-in-law is John Strutz. He's my ex-husband's little brother. He lived with us from 1998 to 2004-ish. He murdered his wife in 2009. They only found her torso. He disposed of the rest of her, but for some reason had her torso in his trash can on the curb when the cops came. John was much, much nicer than his brother. Super dumb. The crazy, convoluted story he told? Absolutely sounds like something my ex would come up with. I can't prove it, but I know in my soul that John probably accidentally killed/grievously injured Kristen during some fight, panicked and called his brother instead of calling 911. And Mike told him what to do and what to say. John's dumber than a sack of hair and didn't wipe his ass, without consulting his psycho but smarter brother. Mike is intelligent but bats hit insane and evil as duck. John stuck to the story and will die in prison. His brother changed his name and washed his hands of him. I don't know what really happened that night, but I know that the whole hacksaw dismemberment and wild OJ type story sounds way more like my ex than something John would concoct on his own. I'm only shocked that my ex wasn't the one with a torso in his trash can. Big thanks to everyone who watched the entire video. We're aiming for 250 subscribers by the end of the year. If you enjoyed it, consider subscribing. Drop a like and share your thoughts in the comments. I'll catch you in the next one.